very warm welcome to this video on the history of demonic magic. I am a spiritual Satanist, and today we're going to be talking about the history of demonic magic, beginning with the ancient Greeks, and then in later videos I'll be moving on to more modern understandings of this topic. So the history of considering there to be forces or things at work really goes back to the time before Socrates, the pre-Socratic time, and it's worth saying that we only have some references, often by Aristotle or Plato, about these philosophers, and so a lot of this comes from mere thought and speculation and second-hand accounts. But nonetheless, we can piece together something. So the word for magic, as in spiritual or demonic magic, was originally magnus. Those of you who have seen the kind of American series where they talk about essentially group in Harvard University, and in this program, this fictional group is called the Magnus Opus. But the word Magnus is very real, and is referring to magic, but particular kinds of magic. So generally celestial magic concerning the movements of the heavenly bodies, and then also divination, where divination concerns more factual branches of magic concerning with things like retrieving information, predicting the future, knowing things, in other words. And the celestial world seemed eternal to the ancient peoples, and therefore it seems very sensible that really an understanding of the supernatural or eternal realms of reality really began by considering the stars. So one thing that was clear was stars seemed to kind of be aware of each other in terms of when constellations moved across the sky, the whole constellation did. Also, the planets and other celestial objects were seen to make patterns relative to each other, and that really indicates that there is some interaction between them. Today we are aware that this is gravity, although there are some branches that deal with looking at the universe to still do some magic, and that's called astrology. But there is definitely an objective sense of interaction, which today we understand through the lens of general relativity and Newtonian mechanics. But at the time, Patroclus, one of the pre-Socratic philosophers, considered the interaction as essentially God influencing the motion of other bodies and influencing each other, because the stars and planets, etc., were seen as gods, and essentially lords of the sky. And really this idea of the celestial and eternal world as being led by spirits that essentially guide the passage of these things is really something of the closest we can get to what guardian spirits we have now, where the word demons actually originates from the word daimones, which is a Greek word, and it simply means a guardian spirit or a lesser deity. So these didn't originally have any kind of correlation with Christianity, because this was pre-Christianity, so it wasn't, demons were associated with fallen angels. They were just guardian spirits, that could be good or bad. And moving on now to really the concept of what makes something living. and beginning to think of metaphysics and what we mean by life. So Aristotle thought that really everything living has a soul, including plants and humans and everything, and associated that with essentially being able to kind of reproduce or being able to move of our own volition, because, essentially he was not aware of how something could move by its own free will or choice unless it was living. And indeed, if you have a particle and there is no field around it, it will seem to be static and not move. And that's another reason for really thinking of the celestial bodies as being alive in some sense, even though they're not. But you can see where these ideas really came from. So when thinking about life and motion, there are a lot of ways to really think about this. So Aristotle thought that the reason why that, say, a pen falls to the earth is because the pen is made of earth and the earth is made of earth, and therefore, since they're made of the same element, they attract each other. Similarly, water might be englobulated with more water, and today we can think of that as van der Waals forces causing the two to interact. But at the time, one could think of it as the same element being attracted to the same element. And this idea of elements was extremely powerful. So people like Anaximenes thought that everything was made by that, say, water. The element water is the thing from which everything was derived. But Anaximander went a bit further and said not only do everything comes from elements, although it was debated what element was responsible for creating everything, but that every element has an opposite, and this idea of opposites and the world being composed of opposites really comes there way before the time of Socrates or Aristotle, at least well before it. And this idea that everything comes from elements was really pulled together by Parmenides, who said that everything is in fact one and unified, and everything comes from essentially the same thing, whichever thing that would be. Some people might even call that thing God, and now we see a a reflection of that idea when people are talking about the whole universe as God, everything that we know to exist as being God. Well, we see the roots of that all the way back to Parmenides. But the atomists agreed with Parmenides, but also disagreed with Parmenides, because they said, well, if you have an object that is made up of an element, there is something indivisible. However, that indivisible thing are atoms of that element, and the atoms of the element make up the object. So the object is divisible, but it's divisible into indivisible things. And therefore, yes, in a sense, all is one, the atom is one, but everything is also made up of lots of different things, or if you have something of an element, the same thing, but lots of the same thing to make that macroscopic thing. And so we see there something that we now know today to be true. We now know atoms are very, very real things. And so that's essentially a summary of the whole. Is everything one? Is things made up of other things? Are things made up of opposite elements? And this idea into looking at the unity of things really have profound consequences in terms of various religious thoughts on the universe and life. So to really conclude this video, and to bring everything all together, I'm going to be talking about the 4 axioms of modern magic, and then later I'll talk further about the history of magic in later videos. But for now, we're just going to cover 4 axioms which are really required to both make sense out of practicing magic to begin with. And it's worth saying that there's a huge amount of different ideas over how modern magic really works. And this is designed to be a overarching thing which all people who practice modern magic can probably agree on, but this is probably by no means exclusive. Anyway, here we go. So firstly, the first assumption that really needs to be held is that there are, in some modern manner of speaking, spirits which exist independently of the collective unconscious. The collective unconscious, being proposed by Jung, is essentially something that develops whenever you have a group of people with similar beliefs. So they have a belief and then they share that belief, and then they use symbols, etc. to demonstrate that belief. And so soon what you have happening is almost a hive mind, something where you have a network of beliefs, and so something that somebody shows or uses can impact suddenly everyone, and then you have an instantaneous response, and this is often used as a criticism for when talking about there being apparent miracles en masse. For example, there was a case where you had almost laughing pandemic, almost in America I think it was, where groups of churches would suddenly, everyone would start laughing, and some people describe themselves as not being able to stop, and that really being a result of the Holy Spirit. However, this could easily be explained by talking about the collective unconscious and how one person beginning to laugh in a religious context or at a religious place can set off everyone almost interacting and involving themselves in this miracle subconsciously, and therefore this miracle is really a result of social dynamics in a religious context. And I'm not debating that the collective unconscious exists. Most people who are psychologists would say it does, and I'm happy to agree with that. But the important thing is that there are spirits which exist, and these are not simply the result of projected emotions like passion or things like that, but these spirits actually exist in and of themselves, independent of the subconscious and the collective subconscious, although undoubtedly the subconscious exists and most likely the collective unconscious too. Another axiom which really needs to be held in order to practice magic, most likely, as I say, I'm trying to be general, though this will probably not be all-inclusive, but I'm trying as best as I can to come up with 4 axioms which really underpin the modern practice of magic. Well, another thing is every living person has a soul, and by that I mean every living person has something which is supernatural or capable of interacting with the supernatural and is distinct from their body, and it has to be distinct in order to do things like astral projection and that kind of thing, where astral projection is similar to meditation, but your spirit goes outside of your body, and a lot of practices believe in astral projection, and then you can do things like build an astral temple and that kind of thing. The Book of the Fallen goes into astral projection in more detail, but to involve in astral projection or any really spiritual thing in a theistic context one needs to have a soul, or something that can interact with the supernatural. As I say, exactly what the soul is much debated. Aristotle had views on it, but modern Christian views are quite different. But there needs to be something that can interact with the supernatural. The third axiom is that magic is driven through the will of the practitioner. So magic is not solely a naturally occurring phenomenon. A lot of the time in Wicca practices, they talk about worshipping or doing ceremonies involving nature spirits and natural healing magic, and that although natural magic might exist, there is a type of magic which operates under the will of the practitioner, and technically this is called black magic. And black magic is really used in a similar way to a way in which a Christian might pray, but whereas prayer is relying on the actions of an external deity, black magic is you causing something to come to pass, or having some kind of agreement with a spirit where the spirit causes something to come to pass. So it's driven by will, and this leads to complications such as the ethics of how you go about this and how you respect others' free will, and also what are the limits of what one should do in comparison to what one can do when wielding such a thing. And there are various views on that. Again, the Book of the Fallen has a section on satanic ethics, and magic is a serious thing to think about in this context. And the last axiom of modern magic is reality is not an illusion. And I bring this up because although in Western culture it is unusual to believe that reality is an illusion, there are plenty of people throughout history and in the modern world who believe that reality is in some way an illusion, and that is an entirely logical standpoint. It is not the only logical standpoint, but it is entirely logical. In fact, Plato, in the allegory of the cave, argues that most of us are living in an illusion, but we can gain knowledge of objective reality called the world of the forms by essentially studying philosophy and mathematics, and through kind of thinking and looking for truth, we can actually escape this and see the world as it truly is. And you can be anywhere from believing that the world is a total illusion to it's totally real, but I would argue because magic is about investment in the world and about trying to cause worldly changes, it only makes sense to practice such a thing if you believe that the world is real. If the world is not real, then attention should be paid to finding out about reality, not changing something which isn't real to begin with, arguably. Although even if the world isn't real, our experience might be, so it might be worth changing it. But I would argue that magic really has its full power if the world is real, because magic is about changing reality, and in the darkest sense to one's will, although I would argue there is more to magic than that. But these are kind of what I would think of as the 4 axioms of modern magic, and I'll be building on them in my material. But this has been a fairly long video, so I'll probably stop now. But later I'll do more videos on the history of magic, and talk more about the axioms of magic and how we can see these arising over the course of history.